That conflict of loyalty has become all too great.
This speech changed the course of history.
It's rather like sending your opening batsmen to the crease, only for them to find their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
This speech was the start of Brexit. This laid the fault line.
The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
So the year is 1990. Geoffrey Howe, the supposed dead sheep of British politics, because he's so boring and such a bad speaker, that was his nickname, is about to make a speech, a totally unexpected speech, that is going to bring down the most powerful woman in Britain, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, after 11 years in power and after 3 election victories. And I think it's right to say her grip on power was fraying. There had been poll tax riots in the streets. This is big, violent, mass demonstrations over a new way of paying local taxes, which were really unpopular, and it was civil unrest on a scale that Britain really hadn't experienced for years. But she was still there. But she'd been in power for 11 years, and that's a really long time. She'd won 3 elections, so the timing for Geoffrey Howe's speech was just perfect.
It's been suggested, even indeed by some of my right honourable friends, that I decided to resign solely because of questions of style and not on matters of substance at all. Indeed, if some of my former colleagues are to be believed, I must be the first minister in history to have resigned because he was in full agreement with government policy.
The relationship between Geoffrey Howe and Mrs. Thatcher was, I think, absolutely extraordinary, which is why I wrote a play about it. I mean, initially, Geoffrey was her friend. Without Geoffrey, Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't have become arguably the most iconic politician in Britain of the last 70 years. Geoffrey saved her because he knew all about economics, and they fought as one when it came to the economy. And he was her Chancellor to begin with, then her Foreign Secretary, and then finally her Deputy Prime Minister. However, their proper friendship, I mean, they really were allies. And if it wasn't for Geoffrey, Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't have lasted more than 2 or 3 years. That's how important he was to her. Their relationship deteriorated very badly. By the time of the speech, Mrs. Thatcher was really annoyed with Geoffrey because basically he was boring and pompous, went on too long and kept banging on about Europe. And Geoffrey Howe was very upset with Mrs. Thatcher because she used to belittle him in cabinet meetings, humiliate him in public by undermining things that he'd just said. And also, crucially, Howe was really pro-Europe. I mean, he was your original Remainer. He loved the idea of Europe. He wanted more Europe, whereas Mrs. Thatcher, in public, was very anti-Europe. She played to the gallery, and Howe just thought that was wrong for the future of the country.
We commit a serious error if we think always in terms of surrendering sovereignty and seek to stand pat for all time on a given deal by proclaiming, as my right honourable friend the Prime Minister did 2 weeks ago, that we have surrendered enough. The European enterprise is not and should not be seen like that, as some kind of zero-sum game. Sir Winston Churchill put it much more positively 40 years ago when he said, "Is it not possible, and not less agreeable, to regard this sacrifice or merger of national sovereignty as the gradual assumption by all the nations concerned of that larger sovereignty which can alone protect their diverse and distinctive customs and characteristics and their national traditions?" I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that I find Winston Churchill's perception a good deal more convincing and more encouraging for the interests of our nation than the nightmare image sometimes conjured up by my right honourable friend.
This speech changed the course of history. It was unbelievable for 2 reasons. Number one, it brought an end to Mrs. Thatcher. Within days of Geoffrey Howe making this speech, she was gone. Secondly, it was incredible because it was so unexpected. Howe was famously boring. He was known as the dead sheep because an opposition politician said being attacked by Geoffrey Howe was like being savaged by a dead sheep. He was that boring. So to make such an incredible speech that was so unexpected. It was headline news all over the world. And thirdly, most importantly, I would contend, and I don't think many historians or playwrights or writers or political observers would disagree with me, this speech was the start of Brexit. This laid the fault line. It was out in the open at last. Previously, everybody knew that there were two sides of the Tory party. One was against the other when it came to Europe. There were pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans, okay? Before Geoffrey Howe's speech, it wasn't really official. My goodness, when Geoffrey Howe made this speech, it exploded into the open. And from that day on, I think Brexit was predetermined. It was always going to happen.
How on earth are the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England, commending the hard AQ as they strive to do, to be taken as serious participants in the debate against that kind of background noise? Mr. Speaker, I believe that both the Chancellor and the Governor are cricketing enthusiasts, so I hope there's no monopoly of cricketing metaphors. It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
The most famous bit in the speech was a reference to cricket. People remember it because it was so beautifully coined by Geoffrey. He expressed it very well. What a lot of people don't know, actually, is that it was suggested by Geoffrey's wife, Elspeth, who was a very formidable public speaker. Elspeth couldn't stand Mrs. Thatcher. Elspeth was also a big cricket fan, okay? She was captain of her school cricket team, would you believe? And she was watching the news the night before with Geoffrey, and they saw on the news Mrs. Thatcher saying,
"The bowling's going to get hit all round the ground. That's my style."
And so Elspeth said, why don't you throw that metaphor back in her face and use a cricketing metaphor yourself? And he said, yeah, good idea. So he did. And the beautiful thing about that little bit of the speech is Geoffrey says, I hope there's no, he said it very boringly. It's hilariously at odds with the kind of exciting content of the speech. He said in his kind of somnolent way, I hope there is no monopoly on cricketing metaphors. He flung it back in her face. And when he said it, everyone burst out laughing. A, because it was funny, and B, the audacity of it. Here was a dead sheep roaring like a lion. It was incredible and so unexpected.
Mr. Speaker, in my letter of resignation, which I tendered with the utmost sadness and dismay, I said that cabinet government is all about trying to persuade one another from within. That was my commitment to government by persuasion, persuading colleagues and the nation. I've tried to do that as Foreign Secretary and since. But I realise now that the task has become futile, of trying to stretch the meaning of words beyond what was credible, of trying to pretend there was a common policy when every step forward risked being subverted by some casual comment or impulsive answer. The conflict of loyalty to my right honourable friend the Prime Minister, and after more than 2 decades together, that instinct of loyalty is still very real, and of loyalty to what I perceive to be the true interest of this nation, that conflict of loyalty has become all too great. I no longer believe it possible to resolve that conflict from within this government. That is why I have resigned. In doing so, I have done what I believe to be right for my party and my country. The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
Do you know, the whole speech is so brilliant, but if I have a favourite bit, it's funny enough, it's one word. It's the perhaps when he says, it is a conflict of loyalty with which I have perhaps wrestled too long. The perhaps just modulates it and gives it nuance. It's so considered and so beautifully kind of rendered. It's not a kind of all-out attack. He's just saying in such an English way, maybe I've had to put up with this crisis of conscience for too young. But maybe I haven't, maybe I have. I think I really like it also because it signalled what was to come. The moment he said, it is a conflict of loyalty, which, my God, it was. And that's what he called his autobiography, by the way, A Conflict of Loyalty. It is a conflict of loyalty with which I have perhaps wrestled too long. Once he said that, you knew there were fireworks coming, but he lit the fuse very gently, if you like, and then... I think the legacy of this speech is just unbelievable, because if there's one thing that has changed the nature of this country and the course of history, of recent history, more than anything, it's Brexit, right? Us leaving the European Union. I think few people would dispute that. It set two parts of the two European parts, if you like, of the Tory party head on against each other in a way they hadn't been before. That speech gave birth, if you like, to lots of mini Farages and Richard Tices and all the other anti-Europeans, and just split the Tory party so massively in two. I don't think it's ever really recovered. So its legacy just cannot be understated. Geoffrey Howe's legacy is really interesting, actually. When he's depicted in things like The Crown, he's just seen as a boring little pompous fat traitor, a bit like Captain Mannering from Dad's Army, who spoke like this and was rather boring, and brought down Mrs. Thatcher because he was jealous and wanted to be Prime Minister. That is absolutely not the case. And when he died, I think it was 2016, 17, the eulogies and the obituaries were quite kind. He was regarded as a great statesman, a great pro-European statesman, almost comically devoid of charisma, but he served his country, he believed in service, he believed in Europe. He will always be remembered primarily for being the dead sheep that became a roaring lion in that speech. But he did a lot more, lots more besides.